Hello, and welcome to our webinar all about promoting student well-being around revision. My name is Alison. I'm the Teacher Engagement Lead at Educake. I'm joined today by Becky Dawson, who is the National Wellbeing Lead at Twinkl. She's going to be sharing her insights into how teachers can better support students in coping with the pressures of exams at every stage of their journey. We're also joined by Rachel Gill, who's an account manager, who's an account manager at Educake. She's going to talk a little bit about how Educake's low stakes assessment can help students prepare for exams in a way that helps to reduce their stress. I'm confident you'll leave this session with some brilliant tips that you can apply to your own practice. Before we get started, I just want to point out the Q&A feature of this webinar, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions for either Becky or Rachel, please do type them into the box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation, which will be in about half an hour's time. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Becky and Rachel. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alison and Rachel. Hi.
Hi.
It's lovely to have you all here this afternoon. In fact, we were just talking about the fact that it's coming towards the end of the first half term, which is always a really tough one, isn't it, when it starts getting darker and colder. So we are really grateful for you attending this afternoon. So yeah, I am the National Wellbeing Lead at Twinkl. My background is in secondary education. I was a drama and English teacher for many, many years and have been a special educational needs coordinator and a safeguarding lead and done lots of different projects to support young people who may be experiencing exam stress. So I'm hoping to bring some of that today. And also, what some people will say when they leave this is that actually that's reinforced I'm doing a good job. And, it's really important to remember that you're probably already doing brilliant things to support the young people that you work with around exam stress. There's no kind of magic wand or sudden panacea that I'm going to share today. It's just that reinforcement that the things you're doing are absolutely brilliant. So why are we talking about this today? Well, I don't need to tell you that there are an increasing number of young people that are struggling with their mental health in general. And we saw a big peak of that after COVID, but actually stress and anxiety around exams is also increasing. So Childline recorded 1,647 counselling sessions around exam stress between April 24 and March 25. And some other surveys, the Save My Exams survey, said that 85% of students said they experience exam anxiety and most don't seek support. So I think that's a really crucial thing for us to remember today, that there will be a lot of young people potentially worrying and struggling with this that maybe aren't coming forward and talking about it. And that's why some of the conversations we need to be having are on a wider scale, in assemblies, in tutor time, those opportunities when we can talk to all young people and not assume that those that are struggling will come forward. We know that there's been an increase in requests for separate exam spaces. Now, that's not always related to anxiety. That may be related to other aspects of need. But I know I used to do the access arrangements for the school I worked at, and I know that for a large majority of young people, needing that separate space is because of the anxiety of sitting in the big exam hall and the challenge that they faced with that. And that's increased from by 8.7% between 2021 and 2023. And actually 28% of students have been withdrawn from GCSE exams due to stress. So for the reasons for withdrawal, 28% of those have been through stress. So there's definitely a challenge here. There is an issue. We know that it's important that young people worry about exams. That stress is actually an important part of our learning and our understanding that we need to do some work. It is an intrinsic motivator, but it is about understanding that balance of where does it tip over into something that might actually be quite damaging moving forward. So we're going to think a little bit about why young people experience exam stress. And one of the key things that you'll take away from today's session is that each individual young person will struggle in different ways for different reasons. And that's why, in fact, in all of the work I do around well-being and mental health, the reminder is that we need to support the individual and think about what the individual needs. And those conversations are absolutely crucial. But just to think about some of the things that might cause exam stress, there might be pressure. on the young person. Now, that can come from lots of different places. It can come from family expectations. It can come from school expectations. So, you know, we know young people, particularly if they are in the higher ability groups, are kind of reinforced this need for them to get particular grades because that's what they are able to do, and they can feel a huge amount of pressure from that. Can feel pressure from the media, pressure from, you know, the expectations that are set all the time about young people knowing what they want to do for a career, and knowing getting the exam results that they need to get to go to the best universities, etc. And that narrative absolutely is played out regularly in the media. I mean, there's the obvious fear of failure, that obvious feeling of not being good enough if you don't do well in your exams, and that feeling, you know, for me, certainly it was a long time ago. I know what my exam results are, but very rare that anyone else asks what my GCSE results are. But, you know, for those young people, it can feel like a huge amount of pressure if they don't pass those exams. For some young people, they might have SEND, and that might be kind of an extra level of pressure. It might mean that accessing the exam is harder. It might mean just the process of sitting an exam is harder. It might be that their cognition and learning is a level that means that it's much harder for them. And so it can be more stressful for them to go through the exams. We know that ultimately exams are pretty much based on memory, aren't they? They're based on recalling information and regurgitating information well. And for some young people with additional needs, that is incredibly difficult. For some young people without additional needs, it is, but that can be an extra level. There's that fear of the future. You know, in schools, we do talk a lot about exam results. We talk a lot about what you're going to do in the future and how getting good results can unlock that future. And we don't mean to do it, but we can sometimes reinforce that fear that if I don't do well in these exams, my future's over. I was reading a post the other day about people threatening, and people saying, oh, you're going to be flipping burgers for the rest of your life. And that's, you know, that is something that people do say. And that fear can, you know, it's meant to be a motivator, but often it can just increase the pressure and the stress, and can really cause more issues than it solves. Some young people just don't know how to revise, and that can be a huge kind of cause of exam stress. They don't know what to do, what are the tools, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. And so they feel a little bit helpless. They feel a little bit like, what magic is going to happen so that I suddenly turn up in this exam and know what I am doing. And then I've kind of touched on this already. There's the fear of the exam itself. So the going into the sports hall, the sitting at the desk, the sitting in silence, that turning over the paper and not knowing what's going to be on it, that in itself can be extremely stressful, can be extremely worrying. It's not something they do, or, you know, the first time they'll probably do that. Well, I think increasingly schools are trying to do exam practice earlier with young people, because actually they recognise that getting used to that process is really important. But even today, when I walk into an exam room in a sports hall with everything set out, I get the jitters a little bit. It just, you know, you get that feeling of, oof, this is a place where I've felt stress before. And so it's understandable that young people will experience those. So the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is to get a little bit of interaction from you. This is what's called a Slido. If you can scan the QR code on your phone, or if you're on your phone and you can't get to that, you can put into the slido.com, go to slido.com and put the number in 519382. I'm just interested to consider what signs of stress you might have noticed in young people around exams. What are the things that you might pick up on that mean that a young person is feeling stress, is feeling anxious, is feeling worried about the exams? So I'm going to give it a minute or so for people to be able to log in and share some of their thoughts. Yes, absolutely. So withdrawing from social life is a really important thing. Again, as I've said already, feeling nervous and worried about exams is normal, and we almost want to encourage that. But when we start to see having an impact on other aspects of our lives, so not going out and seeing our friends, not sleeping because you're kind of ruminating and worrying about things, yet being quick to anger, so those kind of emotional changes, crying at things they wouldn't usually cry at, so having those emotional challenges that they might face. Behavior in lessons, being different, absolutely. So thinking about, is this young person normally like this in lessons? Are they being more belligerent or more withdrawn or more X, Y, and Z? Yes, panic and anger. So often young people that I work with have been showing those signs, and it comes out as anger or aggression. And when you sit down and spend time with them, you just find out they're terrified. They're absolutely terrified about the idea of exams. Yes, some of those physical things. So needing to go to the toilet, yeah, feeling bloated, those physical signs of nerves. Yep, not eating. Absolutely. One of the key things I talk about around mental health is if someone is struggling with their mental health, one of the things can either be eating too much, eating too little, sleeping too much, sleeping too little. So those can absolutely be key things. So some brilliant examples there of things that we might see, and I think you've ticked most of the boxes that we've got on here. So that we kind of divide those signs up into three different areas. So the physical signs, and the reason we divide them into three different areas is because some young people may showing predominantly in one area or another. We might assume that it's going to be the emotional sign. So we might assume it's going to be those young people that are quite tearful or irritable or withdraw or go very quiet. And they might be the young people that we focus on because we can see, okay, they look nervous. They look what I understand as anxious looks like. But we have to think about some of those other behavioural and physical signs. So some of those signs that we've talked about, so someone talked about bloated, poor sleep, things that wouldn't necessarily immediately connect with the exam, feeling sick all the time, having headaches, some of that is physically your body saying actually you're in fight or flight, and you are worrying and you're feeling stressed. And some of them are because they might be saying they're feeling those things because they don't want to engage in school. They feel like if they stay at home, they can pretend that the exams aren't happening, but sadly we know that they absolutely will. Um, and I know that Nick, that actually runs Educate, shared a story, I'm sure she won't mind me sharing here, of her son who was really struggling during exams, and he really struggled with his eyesight and going fuzzy in eyesight, and it turned up he was having kind of stress related migraines, and hadn't made that connection with the fact that it was stress. So being curious about what might be going on for a young person if they are struggling is crucial. And then those behavioral signs. Now, the trouble with some of the behavioral signs is they can be difficult for us as adults to cope with, particularly the ones that we've already talked about. So the anger, the panic, I talked about being more belligerent in lessons. That can feel really difficult for adults to cope with. And sometimes we don't have a huge amount of empathy when a young person is behaving in that way, but we do need to stop and take the time to add it up and go, okay, this young person's got exams coming up, could this behavior be linked, particularly if it's out of character behavior? But we also might see the two ends of the scale here, avoiding work altogether, avoiding revision, because actually sometimes in a young person's mind, if we don't do any revision and don't do any work, then when we fail, we can blame that rather than us not being good enough. And that is a really common thing that I've heard. You'll have heard this in the mocks when young people just say, I'm not going to revise for the mocks, I'm just going to see how I do, and then I'll really work hard for the real things. And actually that is a sign of anxiety, exam stress and anxiety. It's a kind of a get out clause for not doing the revision, because actually they are worried about if they do revise and then don't do very well, what excuse are they going to have? Overworking, perfectionism. So spending hours and hours and hours and revising. I had a young man that I worked with who honestly he could have sat the GCSE English and Maths exams with very little revision and passed both of them because he's just so bright, but he would spend hours and hours. He was autistic as well, and I think that added to the challenges that he found. He could only control his nerves by doing the work, and he talked to me about that. But he was overworking, so he was like working 7 till 7 every day, revising, not giving himself a break. And that was counterproductive. We know that you can't do that for a long time. We know that after a while that learning is not going to stick. And so, it is about getting that balance. And we've talked about changes in eating habits. But the really important message is that one at the bottom is actually stress looks different in every child. Okay, so we can't assume what exam stress looks like. So like we've already said, exam stress on one young person might look like sitting in the corner, rocking quietly, crying. It might look like another young person shouting, effing and jeffing, walking out of the classroom. Those two things could both come from exam stress. They both need and deserve the same time and attention. But sometimes what happens is we will focus on the young person who's crying and upset, because actually that's easier for us to deal with as the adult. The young person who's shouting and getting angry, we tend to go down the punishment behavior route rather than giving the time that we need to listen and understand what's going on for them. So what can we do? And again, I'm really mindful that as teachers, as educators, there is a limit to what we can actually do, because we are not with them 24/7. I mean, there's a limit to what I could do for my son who took his GCSEs 2 years ago, and I I was sure he was revising. And whenever I checked, I created a revision. I was that mum. I created a revision timetable for him. Not sure he followed it. There was only so much I could do, even with a child in my house. So as teachers, there is a limit to what we can do. But what the thing really is to help them to understand what they can do. What are the things that they can do to support themselves in this space? And this is something I talk about not just with the exam stress, but with all mental health and well-being, is if we can get the basics right, then we are in a good position to look after our well-being. So for example, those 5 key things, we've talked about sleeping already. We know that if we don't get enough sleep, our cognition is impacted, our ability to revise and study is impacted. It becomes kind of a vicious cycle, because we then worry about the fact that we haven't done well enough during the day because we didn't have enough sleep, and then it can really impact us. So if we can focus on good sleep, then that is important, and that includes not revising until midnight. That includes not sitting in bed revising, because actually the bed is a place where we should be focusing on sleep. And sometimes if we revise in bed, we then align it with work and we find it more difficult to sleep. Eating is important. So, regular, healthy as we can get our teenagers to eat, snacks. And again, as teachers, you don't have a huge amount of impact on what young people eat, but we can have those conversations. I have taken cans of Monster off young people walking to an exam and had a conversation with them about the fact that, yes, that Monster might help them for the next 20 minutes, but then after that, they're going to have a massive crash from the sugar and the caffeine that's in it, and they're going to be useless for the rest of the exam. So helping them to understand why they need to eat and drink the right things is important as a foundation for that studying. Moving is important, thinking about some young people can get stuck behind the desk and they're just revising. And actually, physical movement is really important to reduce and alleviate some of that stress, particularly when you have to sit in an exam hall for 2 hours and not going to be able to move. So we don't want to be doing that lots. So trying to think about when we can move and how we can move. And also it helps with learning. Moving is really kind of a crucial part. So doing some revision and then going off for a walk is a really good way of embedding that learning. Hydrating, drinking as much as we can. I really struggle to get my two to drink enough. And I know that in schools it can be a bit of a challenge as well, because the more you drink, the more you need to go to the toilet. And lots of schools do have expectations that you're not allowed to go to the toilet in lessons. So getting that balance. But essentially, not hydrating is like driving a car without oil or without diesel or petrol. You're not going to get very far. So making sure that young people are hydrated. And then there's that connection piece, which is, how do we ensure that young people aren't isolating themselves so much because they are revising constantly, they've just got their head down. And so thinking about opportunities to connect, so helping them to keep up with the clubs and things like that they normally do. So what we don't want young people when they into the exams to suddenly stop the football or the guides or the scouts or whatever it is, youth club, whatever it is they attend. That is healthy. That's what we want them to do. They need to have time away from the revision. If they can do that connecting with others, that's really important. And actually, they can revise with each other as well. Sometimes the revision doesn't happen when they're together, but they can, if they are motivated, find ways of revising with each other. That means that they get that connection as well. Just a quick look at the time. So environment is really important around revision, but again, it's one of those things that is very difficult for you in education to influence. But it is important for us to be curious about it and to think about, what does this young person have access to in order to revise? So do they have a calm, distraction-free revision space? Now, as I've said, you don't have access to that information necessarily. You can't change that if they don't. But I think what can sometimes happen is that we can assume that all young people have a space to revise at home, that we can assume that they've all got a desk, they've all got a laptop or something that they can access, and many young people don't have that space. So what we can do as a school is think about, how can I mitigate that? What can we offer young people that means that they do have a space if they need it? So is that about making the library accessible if you've got one after school? Is it about having a set of classrooms that young people can access after school to revise? Now, I know that that then also brings into it the fact that we need staff, and it would have to be thought through really carefully, because what we don't want to do is add to the pressure to staff when we are trying to support young people. But I would argue that, particularly if it's a meeting day, you've got most staff that are in school for a certain amount of time after school, that they can potentially be there to support and supervise young people. If we can make those spaces available, and then really importantly communicate it, and make it as easy to access as possible. So ideally, it should be a case of being able to just turn up and stay. Your schools will have different expectations of whether they need to have signed permission from those sorts of things from parents and carers. Completely understand that, but that's something that maybe can be done at the beginning of the year so that it's signed off once, and we've got that agreement. Because if we put too many barriers in place, particularly those young people that don't have access to a revision space because of the challenges that they're facing at home, maybe they share a bedroom, maybe home just isn't a space they feel comfortable revising in, maybe they don't have the equipment they need to revise. We want to make it as easy as possible for them to be able to access a space where they can revise easily. So just having a think of those things. It's not an easy fix for a school, but it's definitely a conversation that we might need to have, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what we know about, and I'm sure I'm teaching my granny to suck eggs here, what we know and good pedagogy tells us, that actually our attention span is only about 25 to 30 minutes, which is why they all start getting restless halfway through our lessons, isn't it? So thinking about encouraging them to have breaks every 25 to 30 minutes is important. I've seen so many young people who feel like they have to revise, head down for 2-3 hours solidly and think that is good revision, when actually what we know is they need to be having more regular breaks. I think I talk about it later, but there's something called the Pomodoro technique, which is where you set a timer for 20-25 minutes, you really focus, get that work going, and then force yourself to get up and have a break. And that might be getting up and going outside, it might just be standing in the garden, it might just be standing in a different room. But giving yourself that time allows you to reflect on the things that you have learned and really embed, the learning, get those neurons firing, and improves concentration and prevents mental fatigue overall. So thinking about that, and even in the exam hall, whilst they're not going to get up and go for a wander around, just giving themselves a couple of minutes to stop and breathe every 25 minutes is a good way to get themselves in the right frame of mind for the exams. So we're going to have a little think about what a conversation might look like in terms of exam stress and anxiety. And I think what's important to stay here is one of the biggest protective factors around stress is open conversations and communication. And this is where in secondary schools, your form tutors are key, and they are crucial, and they can really make the difference for a young person. And these are the sorts of conversations I would hope that form tutors are able to have with their tutees. Now, I know that can be difficult if you've got a form and there are 30 in there. Um, I was lucky enough to be in a school that had vertical tutoring, which I thought was wonderful, which meant I had some year 9, some 10, some 11s, and you could talk to the 11s while the others were doing something else. But that's a whole different discussion. But thinking about how can you have these conversations with your tutor group, or how can you get your year group tutors to have these conversations with their tutor group? Talk about it early. I was meant to say this at the beginning. The reason we're doing this webinar now and not next March, which sometimes feels like the most obvious time to do this because it's leading up to the exams, is let's talk about these things earlier. Now, I'm not saying that we should worry them all about exam stress, but let's talk about what exam revision looks like, about what preparation for exams looks like in order to support them to reduce that stress. So having these conversations early, and don't assume that they know how to revise, that they know where to revise, that they know what to revise. But we cannot make any assumptions about those things. So particularly about where they're revising, which I've talked about earlier. So having the opportunity to ask open questions. Now, actually, if you were doing this in a tutor group, Slido, which I've just shown you, and if they're allowed to use their phones, Slido would be a really good way to do it. I know some schools don't allow that, but having some way of asking open questions, having a box where they can just ask any question about an exams and put them in, so they're not worried about asking in front of their friends. But equally, if you've got a good form tutor, they will have a relationship with their form, which means that they're not worried about those things. So giving them the opportunity, you're asking them open questions. You know, what are your thoughts on revision? How are you planning for revision? What are your steps going to be? What do you think you might find difficult about revision? Um, being non-judgmental. Now, for many teachers and education staff, we have gone through a gazillion exams, and the chances are, particularly in our subjects, we were probably quite good at the exams, and that's why we got good results, went off to uni, trained to be a teacher, etc., etc., etc. So for many of us, exams, excuse me, that's my child. I'm just going to turn it off. Many exams felt fairly straightforward, and it can feel a little strange to have a young person struggling because it's a little bit of an anathema. So trying not to be judgmental. So trying to recognize that everyone's experience of exams are different. And you may feel like they are overreacting, but actually it's their experience. You can't kind of undermine what they are feeling about the exam. So normalizing nerves is really important. So are you nervous about exams? Yes, good. That's important. That's a normal part of development. That means that you are going to be motivated to work. If you're not worried about them, you might just sit on your bum for the next 2 years and not do anything. So some nerves are important. Normalizing that is crucial. But if those nerves mean that you are not eating or sleeping or seeing your friends, that is where we need to think about, actually, this is having a negative impact. What can we do to support you? And really validating those feelings. I talk about validating feelings all the time when we're talking about well-being and mental health, because so often adults in young people's lives don't do this intentionally, but what they'll do is they'll say, oh, you've got nothing to worry about. Exams are nothing. You might even say, like I've said, no one will know what your exam results were in 10 years' time. There is nothing more irritating to a young person than an old person like me, telling them they've got nothing to worry about. It doesn't take their worry away. It just makes them feel shame for the fact that they're worrying about it. So when I say validating their feelings, I'm not saying we go, oh, yes, isn't it terrible? I'm so sorry you've got to do these exams. We just go, yeah, it's really normal to feel worried about exams. I completely understand why you would be feeling that. I get it. And we validate what they're feeling without, kind of just trying to kind of push it aside and go, no, don't worry, it'll be fine, because that doesn't work. And then we need to think about the practical ways that we can support them. And that's what I'm going to go on to next. So again, there will be lots of things on here that you do. And this is not an exhaustive list. There will also be brilliant things that you do as well. So some of the things that we can do is thinking about how we chunk down the work. And I know that Rachel's going to talk a little bit more about what Educate offers in this space in a moment. But I know that Nick, who's the CEO of Educate, her son did lots of the little quizzes, because what worked for him was that short span of time where he was being tested. It was short, achievable blocks, and he would do like 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and that really worked for him. Realistic planning. I can't tell you the number of young people I've worked with that don't have a revision plan, and that is like the most difficult way to approach exams, is to not have a plan. So I used to run our whole school approach to exams, so I would get parents and carers in, and I would actually give all young people a blank revision plan, which is just an Excel spreadsheet with all of the dates already pre-populated, with a cell for each hour of the day. We would grey out the days when they were in school, because obviously they're already in school, they're already doing work, they can't revise then, and we would encourage them to fill in that revision plan themselves. So what we would say is, you're going to write all of your subjects out, break them down into maths paper 1, maths paper 2, literature, whichever text you've got, write them on a long list and start populating those little cells from your list. You just go through the list, keep populating, and when you get to the end of the list, you start again, and you do that all the way up until the exams. Now, the reason that works well is because it means that they cover all of their subjects, not just the ones they like, because sometimes when we leave revision planning to, I'll do some revision tonight, we do the thing that we enjoy or we find easiest or that we have access to. That way we have to go through all of our subjects. We know, and we used to get our students to do this a few months before the exam, so if they did it that way, they would have like 5 or 6 slots for each part of their subject before their exam. That should be plenty of work that they've got and time to revise. So having a plan is crucial. Having boundaries, and we've talked a little bit about this. I mean, you can revise forever and ever and hours. After a while, it's going to stop having an impact. So having boundaries and clearly saying, I'm going to stop at this time or that time, is really important. A variety of different ways of revising. So some people used to tell me, oh, I just read the textbook, and they were convinced that that was the best way to revise, and I'm fairly certain there are hundreds of studies that tell us that is not the best way to revise. We need to be doing something. So if that is their starting point, let's get them to take sections of it, write bits on the cue card, highlight things, make a mind map. Quizzes, which we're going to talk about in a minute. There are lots of different ways and varieties, and they should be using a variety of different ways to revise in order to keep their brain going. And then metacognition, so helping young people understand what is going on in their brain when they are learning. And we should actually be doing that this a long time before we do anything about revision, but if we haven't, let's do it now. Do they understand how neural pathways are strengthened? Because once they've got an understanding of that, this is really good for parents, carers as well. They can understand that just reading a book is not going to strengthen those neural pathways. They need to be physically doing something. They need to be creating something. They need to have something visual that they can come back to. They need to have something maybe auditory that they can listen to. Once they understand how the brain works to remember things, they can then work around it to do that. And quizzes, really good, really simple. They can do quizzes with each other. They can do quizzes, you know, they can get their people at home to kind of quiz them on stuff. That is a really good way to do revision as well. I'm going to hand over now, because I've talked quite a lot, to Rachel, who's going to give us a little bit of an insight on how Educate can help with this.
Hello, everyone. I'm not going to take up too much more of your time. I've been supporting teachers for about 18 years now. So although I'm not a teacher myself, I feel like I've been in the classroom. I feel like I've felt a little bit of your pain. So with Educate, there's lots of different things we can do. And as Becky said, starting as early as we can, we really think helps as much as possible. So as teachers, obviously, we've identified there's so much that's out of your control, that actually it's really nice that Educate can help to sort of empower you and sort of help you to provide a little bit of empowerment in the way that you can approach revision and exam season. So it can help you to provide by providing accurate reporting, so you can use your markbook and your quiz markbook and analysis tools just to sort of analyze where your students are. You can then decide, is it a whole cohort problem, is it a class problem, or is it an individual problem? And you can use all of that data to inform how you might want to set the rest of your term's worth of work or your revision strategy. You can also then use it to say, break down and set smaller tasks for smaller groups. It's really nice, as we've said before, for providing variety in the way that you're revising. So if you are using book learning, and then you can use the quizzes to interject in between those two things. And it's also really nice to be able to support students one-to-one in a fairly easy way, using it for diagnosis, using it to spot misconceptions, and also for setting those quizzes. So you can set the quizzes, you can have a short, sharp quiz, a 10-minute quiz, you can have a 25-minute quiz. We've identified that sort of magic timing. You can identify all of those things and then use those markbook results to inform where you need to go from there, where you need to intervene. And you can do that really early on in the process, so that hopefully you can work out. And with all of the quizzes with Educate, if they get a question wrong, they get that instant answer recap slide. So it's embedding that knowledge straight away and really building on retrieval practice. Once you've set a quiz for them as well, I'm sure most of you already know, if you're customers of ours, they can choose to do that quiz as many times as they like. So it's just, once it falls into their quiz bank, it becomes almost a bank of revision resources as well. So moving on to how it can support students, I think it's all about empowering them. It's about giving them the confidence and the independence to learn in a structured way, to know what they're learning. Like we've said, with revision, it's really, really difficult for them to always know where the gaps in their knowledge are, because they can't always identify themselves. So as they log in with Educate, what they can do, they can see that bank of quizzes that they've answered already. They're all RAG rated. They can go in and do those as many times as they like. So they get an instant recap slide, as I said. So if they do get the question wrong, they get that recap slide straight away. That's embedded in their knowledge. And hopefully, if they're just short quizzes, they'll do them several times, and you can see how they've improved their score, and they can see as well. And actually, it's quite a nice thing for parents. If they log in with their children, they can go in and they can help them to identify what they need to be working on and really make it nice and targeted. They can also go in and study and quiz themselves. So they can go in, select the topic area that they're interested in, or that they feel might be a gap for them, and the system will provide quizzes based on that for them as well. And then we have the adaptive algorithm built in. So if they click into Revision Wizard, it will give them a targeted bespoke quiz based on all the gaps in their knowledge. If you're setting work consistently, it can kick in and be really, really useful. As I say, then every student that's logging in will get something that's targeted, meaningful and bespoke for them. So again, you can be confident that the system is providing them with really meaningful revision resources. They're not just home highlighting or sticking a post-it on something and hoping for the best. And you can also then check in the markbook, and you can check in on what they're doing, and you can start to use that to inform next steps. And if, like we say, if we're doing that early on, we're building those early habits really early on, and it's giving them a bit of resilience as well. It's telling them they can see early on where their gaps are, and they can take charge of that, and they can become independent, and they can become more confident. And as the journey goes on through the year, they can actually feel a little bit more like, yeah, I can walk into this room, I know what I'm doing. It's, they've taken charge of their own learning. So I think there's lots of different things that Educate can help with, teacher wise and student wise. So definitely, there are resources on our website that can help with both teacher and student revision guides, things like that. We will be following up with the webinar with some tips and tricks as well. So it's just keep an eye out for those emails. And if you've got any questions or you need any additional support, always reach out to your account manager, because they are here to help. And we know it's a really tricky time, and we want to be able to help you to get the most out of the subscription that you've purchased, and also just to help you and your students. So yeah, reach out to us if you need any more assistance, and I'll pass back to Becky.
Fab, thank you. And literally just coming to the last couple of slides now. So just some things to remember if a young person is really struggling with exams stress in the moment. We can talk them through some breathing techniques. So there's something called box breathing, which is really easy. We breathe in for 4 as we go up the side of the box. We hold for 4 at the top. We breathe out for 4 as we imagine going down the side, and then we hold for 4 at the bottom. And we can do that quite a few times to really, essentially, when we're feeling that exam stress, and we haven't got time to go into it all today, but it is about that fight or flight. It's about our body is going into getting ready to run away from the dangerous thing, which when we developed fight or flight, when we were hunter-gatherers, was probably a scary animal. But for these young people, it's the exam room. So it's about thinking about how do we slow down our nervous system? How do we kind of go into our parasympathetic nervous system and kind of get that more relaxed feeling? And sometimes that is just through breathing. Reframing, you know, thinking I'm feeling really nervous, but actually that's good. That's because I want to do well. That's because I know this is important, and try not to focus on the feeling of nerves, helping them to reframe it. You know, it's only however many hours long, 2 hours long. I'll be out in 2 hours. It'll all be over. Trying to focus on that end point. Visualization can be a really good one. So either visualizing something beautiful like the image that we've got on the screen, so getting them to, and we practiced this before we would go into the exams, getting them to visualize something, a place where they feel safe, like what is their safe space. And it might be a favorite holiday spot, it might be their bedroom, it might be anywhere, the skate park, whatever it is. Give them the time to visualize it, think about what they hear, what they see, what they smell, what it feels like, and build that into their toolkit, so that if they are in the exam and they're freaking out and they're really struggling, they can just stop and do some of that breathing and visualize where are they sitting, just taking that time to give themselves a moment. And then aid memoirs. Well, these will be different for different exams, but sometimes it can be really useful just to get into the exam, get sat down and write something down that they know will be really helpful. So if it's in English, for example, you've got things like PETAL, which is the acronym to help you remember how to structure your answers. So it might just be about getting that written down. There might be some formulas or something or other you can write down in science. You can tell I'm not a science teacher. Something that is an aid to just getting something on paper, something written down to kind of focus on. It's not the answers, it's not everything, but it's just that moment of, I do know something. I'm going to write that down and I'm going to focus on that. But reminding them that in the exam, it's not like every second counts. They can take 2 minutes out to stop and breathe if they are feeling that they are panicking. They can just give themselves a moment to put their pens down and just focus on a spot and breathe. Really, they can even do progressive muscle relaxation. There's lots of different things they can do. That it's not having that panic feeling of I've got to do, constantly working constantly throughout the session. And then finally, just some easy reminders. Language matters. So how we're talking about exams matters. The way we express the importance of them passing the exams matters. So thinking about how are we sharing these messages about exams? What are we saying to them? Are we saying these are the most important things they're going to do, and if they fail, it's going to be terrible? Are we telling them that their whole lives hang on these exams? That's not going to be helpful with exam stress. Highlighting the importance, telling them that they'll give them opportunities, great. Giving them the scare factor, not so much. Avoiding comparison. So, you know, comparing with other students, comparing with other, oh, my other class are much better than this class, or my last year's students were much better prepared than you, or even worse, that I had, your sisters were much better at this than you are. So trying to avoid comparison with people. Not are you revising, how are you revising? So let's not focus on whether they're doing it, let's focus on how they are doing it. So that's if you ask a young person, are they revising, and you're their teacher, they're going to say yes. If you ask them, how are they revising, that's going to give you a bit more insight into. So if they say, oh, I do 10 minutes on the bus in the morning, you can probably talk about the environment they're in and whether that's useful, etc. What is their why? Now, getting the balance here is really important. But if we have a young person that knows where they want to be, has an idea of career or even area, or, you know, that they want to go to university, for example, if we can reinforce that this would be a really important step for you, not pressure, not telling them their life's going to be a failure if they don't do it, but having that why as a motivation, you know, can be really important. If you think about Simon Sinek's work, he talks all about whys and why those things can be motivational. And then partnership. Who are we working with? Now, that can be partnerships in school. If you're a subject teacher, do you know this young person's form tutor? If you're a form tutor, are you communicating with the subject lead teachers that they might be struggling? Are we working with home? That's probably one of the most important things. If you can do a session like I've done this evening for your parents, brilliant. That's so helpful for them to understand what they can do to help at home, because you can sometimes feel absolutely helpless. I've been doing this for years and I still feel helpless with my son, but giving them some insight into that can be really helpful. So we've come to the end of time. We've got, not the end of time, that sounds a bit deadly, it's been a long day, the end of the session, I'm just going to show one more slide where I ask you a favour. If you can, I'm working with UCL, and this does link in with what we're talking about. I'm working with UCL around how do we have conversations with young people when they are experiencing challenges with their mental health and well-being, and that could well be with exam stress. And we are asking teachers to give us their feedback. If you can scan that QR code and fill in that survey, I would be so grateful, because we are going to create a resource. We're going to write a report on it to really share what brilliant work teachers are doing and what support they need to do, continue doing it. But that is the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Becky and Rachel. Really, really appreciate it. So we're going to have a look at the questions. So there's a Q&A function that I mentioned. If you do think of any questions, do please enter them there. Someone's given a lovely bit of feedback about Educate English, and also a request for some new content that they would like to see. So I've just sent a typed answer to them about that. But thank you so much. We love any feedback that we receive about Educate and what you'd like to see, because it really helps us to improve. Other questions? How can I support students as an invigilator? What if I see a student who's clearly struggling during an exam?
That is a really, really good question, and I think it's something that comes up quite often. So if we go back to the slide I showed toward the end, if a student is really struggling in an exam, it is obviously difficult to do anything too big with them in that moment, but we can suggest like some breathing exercises, or as an invigilator you can take that young person outside of the doors and give them a moment outside of the room and have an actual conversation with them about what they might be struggling with. And I think in some ways that's probably the most powerful thing we can do. Also, watching as young people come in as an invigilator, you know, having a look at their body language, seeing how they're looking can help you head off some of those things at the past. You know what, smiling is a really big thing we can do as invigilators. So often I've been in exam rooms and I've just seen these really serious faces of the teachers because it's an exam, it's serious, but actually no, we can smile, it's okay. And it's okay to kind of give a reassuring nod and a smile at a young person, or just a, are you okay, like just a check in. Is crucial. Making sure they've got some water if they look like they are kind of really struggling in that moment. So some water, kind of just remind them that they can take a minute to take a breath, just to have a moment. If they need to move outside of the room, then just check with the lead invigilator, but take them outside and just give them a moment. But it is about that reassurance that they are going to be okay, because sometimes this is their physiological body kicking in and telling them they've got something to be scared of when they don't.
Amazing, thank you. Another question, how do you recommend communicating these tips with parents?
So, I mean, the thing I recommend is what we used to do is, and I know this is hard sometimes, is to get parents in. And what we would do is we would get parents in with their young person, and I would run a very similar activity, but I would get them to do some revision skills activities in the room. So I would give them an article from anything, it doesn't really matter what it is, and we would talk about mind maps, and I would get them to create a mind map together. So the parent and the young person are creating a mind map. The reason being is that gets the conversation started. It gets them thinking about what revision actually is. So that metacognition that we're talking about, understanding how we learn. Let's not assume that parents understand that as well. So giving them that time to do that. Now, that might be difficult. Not all parents can make it. You know, it's more difficult in secondary to get parents in often. So I would suggest having the same information in a few different formats if you can. So having an evening where people can come in. I think we only did like a 90-minute session. Having an evening when people come in, you might want to connect it with something else that's going on, so they've got another reason to come in. Maybe doing something online so other people can access it in a different way online at a different time of day. But then also you could create an exam newsletter. So lots of the stuff I've talked about today, you could put into a newsletter and you can share with parents, fairly straightforward, and get some feedback that way. But I do think it's really important if you can get the young people. So maybe you've got like a year 10 parents evening, a year 10 tutor parents evening early. Start it with a session if that works. But getting the parents and the young person in together was the bit that worked for us, because then they were having conversations. I mean, the reality is you often get the parents there that don't actually need to be there, which is always often the way with parent events, but that can work well.
That's great, thank you. I really appreciate everyone who turned up for this webinar. I think, like Becky said, now's the time to be having these conversations rather than in March, so it's such an important thing to think about. Lots of practical tips to take away as well. As I said, we'll be sending a follow-up email in a few days' time to everyone who registered for the webinar with that recording, with that link for the survey that Becky gave, so you can easily go back and revisit anything. So thank you so much again to everyone who attended, to Becky and to Rachel. Becky, where can people follow you on social media?
So I'm mainly on LinkedIn, so you should be able to find me, Becky Dawson, on LinkedIn. But I do also have a Facebook page and Instagram. So just Becky Dawson Wellbeing. If you put that in, generally I will pop up. Thank you so much.
Amazing, thank you. And if you have any questions for Educate, please do get in touch at support@educate.co.uk. If there's anything at all that we can help with, we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thanks again to everyone, and bye for now. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.